Early one morning, a concerned mother sat beside her young son inside of a hospital room. He was lying in the bed, curled into a ball, and he was drenched with sweat, and he was clutching his stomach. His doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and until they did, they couldn't cure him. For now, all they could do was keep the boy hydrated and hope for a breakthrough. But, judging from how miserable her son looked, it didn't seem like the doctors were helping at all. The mother was starting to get worried that her little boy's life was in danger. The mother stood up to call the nurse when all of a sudden she felt dizzy and lightheaded. She sat back down and realized she was starting to sweat a lot. This was exactly how her son's illness had started. Whatever he had, now she had it too. What she didn't know, though, was that thousands of other people were experiencing the same terrifying symptoms too. This was just the beginning of an outbreak that would spread across the entire United States, and there was no cure in sight. From Ballen Studios in Wonder Why, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please offer to detail the follow button's car, but be sure to hide a slightly open can of tuna under their front seat. This episode is called Common Ground. On August 8th, 1998, Sharon Anderson's eyes shot open to the sound of her 8-year-old son's wailing. She glanced over at the bedside clock and saw it was only 4:00 a.m. Toby, her son, was a very deep sleeper, so she knew it had to be something serious to wake him up at this hour. So, Sharon jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall to his room. Toby was still in his bed and he was holding his belly with both hands. He was covered by a film of sweat, and he was moaning in pain. Sharon laid the back of her hand on Toby's forehead, and she found that he was burning hot. In fact, he felt much hotter than when he normally got sick. Sharon knew her son needed medical attention right now. She rushed back to her bedroom, woke up her husband, and told him to go get the car ready so they could drive their son to the emergency room. Then she ran back to Toby's room. She scooped him up in a blanket and carried him down the hall. It was still dark out as Sharon and her husband loaded Toby into their car. Fortunately, the streets of Minneapolis were empty at that hour as they raced to the nearest hospital. Attending physician Dr. Jean Miller was just starting her shift when her office intercom buzzed, and a voice announced that an 8-year-old boy named Toby had just been wheeled into the ER. His mother, Sharon, said Toby had been feverish for hours and was throwing up. Dr. Miller jumped up from her desk and dashed down the hall to the emergency room. She found Toby lying in bed, his eyes half open and his skin drained of color, while his pajamas were dark with sweat. The boy's parents hovered beside the bed, looking worried and helpless. Dr. Miller called for a nurse to bring an IV saline drip to get some fluids into the boy. Then she measured his heartbeat and listened to his breathing. But the child's intense stomach pains suggested that whatever was going on was an intestinal issue. That covered a lot of possibilities, from food poisoning to something much more serious like appendicitis. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents if he'd eaten anything unusual lately. They looked at each other and listed various meals from the past few days, but then said that nothing out of the ordinary came to mind. Dr. Miller nodded, then asked Toby where it hurt most. With very shaky hands, Toby pointed to his stomach. Tears formed in his eyes and he told Dr. Miller the pain was getting even worse. Dr. Miller smiled calmly, doing her best to hide her concern that Toby seemed to be sinking. The doctor grabbed a phone off the wall and called the lab to order blood and stool samples that would likely identify what was happening inside of Toby's body's body. The doctor was pretty sure it was some kind of food poisoning, but the boy's intense discomfort suggested that it could be more serious than your run-of-the-mill 24-hour stomach bug. Dr. Miller took the parents aside and told them to make a list of every food and every place that Toby had eaten in the past 4 days. Dr. Miller promised they would find out what was happening to their son, and they would do everything in their power to make him right again. A few hours later, Dr. Miller's phone rang. It was the lab with Toby's results. They found blood in Toby's stool, which indicated intestinal bleeding, most likely from bacteria in his food. So Dr. Miller had apparently been right. It was some kind of food poisoning. Now they needed to figure out what kind of food poisoning it was. The lab technician said they had already isolated the bacteria from Toby's stool for closer analysis. Dr. Miller thanked the technician and hung up. The good news was that they were now closer to knowing what was making Toby sick, but the bad news was until then, Dr. Miller could not really aggressively treat Toby's illness. For many bacterial infections, the best treatment is antibiotics, but with certain strains of bacteria, such as highly toxic strains of E. coli, antibiotics can actually make the patient sicker or even kill them. So for now, all Dr. Miller could do was keep Toby's fever down with medication and his dehydration at bay with an IV drip. Dr. Miller checked in with Toby's parents and told them to get some rest, and that she would be back at the hospital first thing in the morning. Then the doctor left the room and went to the night nurse and told her to please contact her at home if anything changed with Toby. The next morning, Dr. Miller had just sat down behind her desk with a mug of coffee when a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said there was a new arrival to the ER, 4-year-old girl named Peyton Egger. She had a sweltering 100-degree fever, and her mother said she'd been vomiting on and off for 12 hours with repeated bouts of diarrhea. Dr. Miller's mind raced as she followed the nurse down to the emergency department. White curtains were drawn all around a gurney that had just been wheeled in. Little Peyton was lying on the gurney, drenched in sweat. Her face was drained of color, and she was struggling to keep her eyes open, and her parents stood to the side, clutching each other nervously. Dr. Miller immediately ordered the nurses to hook Peyton up to an IV drip while she checked the girl's vitals. Peyton's pulse was weak and her blood pressure was dropping. Dr. Miller worried she might be going into shock, which could cause her organs to shut down. Dr. Miller realized that Peyton's symptoms were very similar to Toby's, so much so that she wondered if both kids had caught the same infection. Peyton's parents told Dr. Miller that their home was in a suburb north of Minneapolis, which was nowhere near where Toby's family lived. Still, Dr. Miller thought there must be something these two kids had in common. Dr. Miller called the lab and told them she wanted full blood work run on Peyton plus stool samples tested as well. Then Dr. Miller took Peyton's parents into the hallway and asked them for more details. The mother said that Peyton had been complaining of stomach pains last night, but it really hadn't seemed that serious. But at around midnight, Peyton woke up crying from all the pain, and then began vomiting after that. She kept vomiting nearly every hour and had several episodes of severe diarrhea. Then her temperature started spiking. By dawn, the parents said it was clear that whatever this was, it was only getting worse, so her parents had rushed her to the hospital. Dr. Miller said they had done the right thing. Peyton would be safe here for now. The best thing they could do was just stay calm and wait. But that was advice Dr. Miller found easier to give than to practice. As Dr. Miller stepped out of Peyton's room and headed back to her office, a nurse hurried up to her and said the lab had been trying to reach her. Toby's new results were in. The boy was infected with a bacteria called Shigella. Finally, Dr. Miller knew what she was up against. Shigella attacks the digestive system, causing inflammation and bleeding within 12 to 48 hours after eating food contaminated with the bacteria. Toby had all of the classic symptoms: fever, abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea. Dr. Miller knew that if untreated, Shigella could send Toby into shock, which often leads to organ failure and occasionally even death. But at the same time, Dr. Miller was relieved. Although Shigella was obviously serious, it could be defeated with antibiotics, so she could finally start treating Toby. Dr. Miller told the attending nurse to prepare antibiotics for Toby and begin administering them as soon as they were ready. Then Dr. Miller rushed to Toby's room to give his parents the news. The boy was lying in his hospital bed with his eyes half open. His mother sat in a chair next to the bed, holding her son's hand and looking flushed and exhausted. Dr. Miller asked Toby's parents to step outside with her so she could explain what was going on, but when Toby's mother tried to stand up, she wobbled and had to sit back down. She admitted she had not been feeling well since she woke up that morning. She said she even vomited a couple of times. Dr. Miller told Toby's mother to stay seated while she called for a nurse to prepare a bed for her. The doctor told her it was entirely possible that she was also now infected with Shigella, which was the bacteria that they had just discovered her son was infected with. After all, Shigella is so contagious that it can be passed in a handshake if someone who touched the bacteria didn't wash their hands well enough. As soon as Dr. Miller had settled Toby's mother into her own hospital bed, a receptionist waved the doctor down. It was the lab calling again. They had the results for Dr. Miller's other young patient, Peyton. She had Shigella too. Dr. Miller put down the phone. First Toby, then maybe Toby's mother, and now Peyton. Suddenly, Dr. Miller felt like she had an outbreak on her hands. And given how easily Shigella is transmitted, there were likely dozens more people out there suffering symptoms at home, and every one of those cases could make more people sick. Suddenly, Dr. Miller had a lot of calls to make. Later on that same afternoon in August of 1998, a young epidemiologist at the Minnesota Department of Health named Dr. Julie Wickland was sitting at her desk when her secretary buzzed. She told her there was an urgent call coming in from a local hospital. Dr. Wickland was only in her 22nd and still trying to prove herself professionally. But one thing she had already learned was that being an epidemiologist meant everything was a potential emergency. People's lives were always on the line. She picked up the phone and called Dr. Miller, who described the potential Shigella outbreak she was facing. 3 cases in her hospital and likely a lot more people at home right now who just weren't sick enough to head to the hospital yet, but soon they would be. Once Dr. Wickland was done hearing from Dr. Miller, she requested to have Toby and Peyton's families fill out food history charts with everything they had eaten in the past 4 days. Then she met with her team at the Department of Health and assigned some of her best investigators to join her on this case. By the time she got back to her office, Dr. Wickland's secretary came in holding a stack of papers. The families had already filled out and faxed over their kids' food histories. Dr. Wickland spread them out on her desk and scanned them to look for commonalities. Right away, she noticed a pattern. They had all eaten at a restaurant called Roberta's. The odds were extremely low that both Toby and Peyton's families had eaten at the same place in the same 4-day window, especially considering how far apart they lived. And so, this was exactly the type of breakthrough Dr. Wickland was hoping for. An hour later, Dr. Wickland and 2 other health officials stepped out of a dark sit-in in front of the restaurant Roberta's, a modest neighborhood eatery. The manager was waiting for them by the entrance, looking very tense. The restaurant was temporarily closed for the rest of the day so that Dr. Wickland and her team could go and conduct their investigation there. Dr. Wickland needed to inspect every aspect of the restaurant's food handling for possible sources of contamination, such as spoiled food or dirty water. Dr. Wickland assigned one investigator to record the temperatures inside the refrigerators and freezers, while another investigator took water samples from all the sinks and taps. Then, Dr. Wickland studied every step in the food's journey to the table, from the delivery area to the storage room to the food prep stations. The overall layout at Roberta's met safety standards, but Dr. Wickland knew how elusive Shigella could be. Shigella can show up almost anywhere and then can be spread by the people who are simply preparing the food. Dr. Wickland told the manager she needed to interview the entire staff, and so once the staff was gathered in the dining room, Dr. Wickland circled the room, asking each employee questions about their recent health and also their daily kitchen routine. Several members of the staff admitted to Dr. Wickland that they had not been feeling very good lately. Some had even been feverish and suffering pretty severe abdominal pains. It sounded worryingly similar to what Toby and Toby's mother and Peyton were all experiencing. Dr. Wickland then made copies of the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts from the past 4 days. Flipping through the pages, she estimated at least 400 people had eaten at Roberta's within a few days of when Dr. Miller's patients had eaten there. All of these diners were now at risk of getting Shigella. Back at the office, Dr. Wickland wrote up a questionnaire for all of Roberta's 400 diners. She needed to determine how many other customers out there were suffering similar symptoms. If any of them had contracted Shigella but didn't realize it, they could be infecting other people. These people needed to be notified right away, or else this situation could get much worse. The next morning, when Dr. Wickland arrived at her office, she learned that one of her brother's employees had tested positive for Shigella. This confirmed that everyone who had eaten at the restaurant could now potentially be infected with the Shigella bacteria, but at least she now had a pretty good idea where the Shigella was coming from: a sick food prep worker who likely had not washed their hands properly. Dr. Wickland's first step was to call Roberta's and order the restaurant temporarily closed until the Shigella outbreak was totally contained. Then Dr. Wickland called Dr. Miller to get an update on her patients. Dr. Miller told her that Toby's mom was doing fine, but Toby and Peyton were struggling. Shigella is always harshest on the young and the elderly, and the children's conditions were not getting better. If they didn't start getting better soon, Dr. Miller feared they could go into shock and die. Early the next day, Dr. Wickland's phone rang with new results from the lab. Several more employees at Roberta's restaurant had tested positive for Shigella. This meant that the disease outbreak was not coming from a single unsanitary worker. It was coming from lots of places. Dr. Wickland got a fresh cup of coffee and then sat down at her desk to begin studying the first wave of questionnaire results from Roberta's recent customers. And she was disturbed to see that a full half of the 400 diners reported experiencing symptoms that were consistent with Shigella. But as Dr. Wickland studied the responses, something about the data just didn't seem right. A large percentage of infected diners had eaten at Roberta's before any of the employees started to get sick, so it was unlikely that the employees were giving the infection to the customers. The workers were actually victims too. Dr. Wickland leaned back in her chair and took a deep, defeated breath. She now realized that she actually had no idea where all the Shigella cases were coming from. An hour later, the manager at Roberta's unlocked the restaurant door and lead in Dr. Wickland. She told the team to put on gloves and start discarding every piece of food in the building. Nothing could be saved. Roberta's manager was happy to comply, and Dr. Wickland told him the business could reopen once all the food had been thrown away and the entire restaurant professionally cleaned. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Dr. Wickland pulled a bin of produce off a shelf and dumped it in the trash. The Shigella was somewhere under this roof, and Dr. Wickland was not going to let it slip past her. Dr. Wickland returned to her office at the Department of Health to find a report sitting on her desk. Her heart sank. It was the details of another case of Shigella, this time north of Minneapolis. A 33-year-old woman had been rushed to a hospital after hours of vomiting, fever, and diarrhea. The night before, the woman had eaten at an upscale restaurant in her neighborhood called Marty's. Not only that, but she'd gone to the restaurant with multiple friends, all of whom had been contacted unreported feeling sick. But Marty's restaurant was very far from Roberta's. For this illness to strike the restaurants in entirely different areas, miles apart from one another, was extremely rare. Dr. Wickland sighed and called the manager at Marty's to tell them the restaurant would have to close until further notice. She said that a health official would be there shortly to collect their reservation, list and credit card receipts, and all their recent diners would need to be contacted about the disease outbreak. Dr. Wickland then called a meeting with her investigators to brainstorm. She felt lucky that there had been no fatalities so far, but she also knew that young children were in the greatest danger. She told her team they had to find the link between Marty's restaurant and Roberta's restaurant that could explain all the Shigella cases. Maybe both restaurants sourced particular food items from the same place, or maybe an employee worked part-time at both restaurants, or maybe they shared a water supplier. Whatever it was, she told her team they had to go find out. By the next afternoon, Dr. Wickland had more information to go on. She and her team had worked around the clock, contacting people and compiling timelines of symptoms. It was a lot to sift through, but she knew it was always better to have too much information rather than not enough. As Dr. Wickland made her way through all the paper piled on her desk, the differences between the two restaurants really jumped out at her. Marty's got its water from a different reservoir than Roberta's, so this was not a water issue. There was also almost zero overlap in their menus because Roberta's and Marty's served very different types of food. And a review of the two restaurants' employees showed that no staff members worked in both places either. The researchers could not even identify a single food that all the sick customers at each restaurant had eaten. Everyone ordered different dishes, yet got sick the same way. And so Dr. Wickland wondered to herself, how could that be? This just doesn't seem possible. Just then the phone rang. It was the lab with an update on the Marty's restaurant customers. Everyone who tested had come back positive for Shigella. The lab had also done a genetic comparison of the Shigella bacteria from the Marty's diners and the Roberta's diners, and they found them to be identical. Clearly, both restaurants had been contaminated by the same source. Dr. Wickland thanked the technician and hung up. She felt stumped, exhausted, and ready to call it quits for the day. But she did have a couple more calls to make. The first one was just a checkup on Toby and Peyton. On the other end of the line, Dr. Miller sounded equally exhausted. She said Toby was still bedridden because his body was not responding to the antibiotics. He was now faced with a painful and slow recovery. Little Peyton Negger was even worse. Dr. Miller had nurses monitoring her around the clock, but her family was obviously worried sick. Dr. Wicklund thanked her for the update. Then she hung up and scrolled through her Rolodex until she found the United States Centers for Disease Control. This outbreak was clearly not settling down the way Dr. Wicklund hoped it would, and so it was time to call in reinforcements. Dr. Timothy Namey was in his office packing up to head home when his phone rang. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but his position as an epidemic intelligence officer at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had taught him the danger of missing an emergency call. So he picked up the phone and he listened carefully as Dr. Wicklund explained the events of the past week and how the Shigella outbreak showed no signs of slowing down. Dr. Wicklund said she needed the CDC's help in finding the outbreak's origin so they could stop it. Every bacterial outbreak has its own genetic fingerprint that makes it unique, and the CDC keeps a massive database of these fingerprints from all over the world. Dr. Namey told Dr. Wicklund to email him an image of the Shigella bacteria's DNA profile. Then he could use the CDC's database to see if the same Shigella strain had been reported anywhere else. The moment Dr. Namey uploaded the Shigella bacteria from Minnesota to his database, Shigella outbreaks in other areas popped up all over, from Los Angeles County to Boston to Florida, plus up in Canada and Alberta and Ontario. Each outbreak had been linked to a specific restaurant, and all were genetically identical. This meant that there was a good chance all of these Shigella outbreaks were caused by the same source of contamination. The sheer breadth of locations baffled Dr. Namey. He stared at the map. How did the same contaminant spread across both coasts, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and all the way up into Canada? He emailed his co-workers the results and asked them to help him contact every restaurant associated with an outbreak and compile a comprehensive list of foods and ingredients on their menus. There had to be something in common to all of them that was carrying this particular strain of Shigella. The next morning, one of Dr. Namey's fellow investigators strolled into his office and handed him a post-it note with one word written on it. Dr. Namey read the note and couldn't help but laugh. The investigators had identified the probable source of the Shigella outbreak, and it was something that no one suspected. Dr. Namey's department even had a term for this particular ingredient. They called it stealth food because it's used in a wide variety of dishes, yet usually goes unnoticed. Dr. Namey congratulated his team. This was the best lead they had. He picked up a phone and he called a colleague at the Food and Drug Administration named Jeremy Brown. Dr. Namey told Jeremy what they had discovered and said he'd need the FDA's help tracing this particular ingredient, the stealth food, to the original supplier. Global supply chains for restaurants are incredibly complex, with food shipping from across the world and constantly being reprocessed and repackaged. And so, finding one bad batch of food among all of that would not be easy. Jeremy said he would get to work. A few days later, Jeremy rode in a Jeep through Ensenada, Mexico and Ensenada. At first, the countryside was dry and dusty, but as they curved over a hillside, suddenly everything turned green. For miles into the distance, Jeremy saw nothing but crops in organized rows. Finally, they turned onto a dirt road and passed a sign that said the name of the farm, Vale Verde. The farmhand pointed out different fields of produce, including tomatoes, celery, cilantro, green onions, radishes, and lettuces, all watered by massive irrigation machines. But the biggest spread of all was an entire 55-acre parcel devoted to growing nothing but the stealth food Jeremy had come to investigate. And the stealth food was parsley. At some point between when it was harvested and when it was shipped, this parsley was becoming contaminated with Shigella bacteria. Jeremy was not going to leave the farm until he found out where and how this was happening. The Jeep came to a stop on the banks of an old riverbed. Since tainted water is the most common cause of Shigella, Jeremy had requested to visit the farm's water supply first. The farmhand hopped out and led them to a series of wells that provided all of the farm's water. Jeremy looked inside one of them. The stone casing was old but uncracked. The shaft was dug very deep so that the water came from far underground, which meant the likelihood of contamination was actually quite small. Jeremy could tell the issue was not the wells. Next, the farmhand drove them past several meadows to a reservoir that served as the farm's backup water supply. It looked like a small, fresh lake. The water seemed clean, but Jeremy still bottled up a couple of samples for testing back in the US. The farmhand asked Jeremy where he wanted to head next. Jeremy said he could use a break from the heat. It had gotten much hotter as the afternoon wore on. A few minutes later, the Jeep rumbled to a stop in front of a huge farm shed with a corrugated steel roof. It contained long conveyor belts stacked with crates of parsley. At the end of the line, men took those crates and stacked them on a pallet and then hosed them down with chilled water from a machine called a hydro cooler. Jeremy watched as hundreds of boxes quickly piled up and were loaded into the backs of huge trucks and then driven away to be shipped all across North America. Jeremy asked the farmhand if the water for the hydro cooler came from their wells or the reservoir, but the farmhand shook his head and said neither. The water for the hydro cooler came from Ensenda's municipal water supply. Jeremy put on his sunglasses and told the farmhand that was where he needed to go next. At the municipal water plant, the facility's director admitted that they had been a bit overwhelmed lately. Due to government funding cutbacks, they had been understaffed for a while, with fewer security guards to watch the place. There had been a few break-ins lately, and some equipment had even been damaged. At one of the water filtration systems, Jeremy noticed that the machine that normally disinfects the water with chlorine was shut down. Jeremy asked the manager if the chlorinator had just been turned off today, or if it really was not working at all. The manager shook his head in frustration and said this had been on their list to get fixed for over a month, but the city hadn't managed to send over the parts yet. Jeremy did his best to hide his shock. Without chlorine, all sorts of contaminants could flourish in the water, including Shigella. From there, the water was pumped to businesses, homes, and farms all over the area, like the parsley crop at Vale Verde area. Jeremy filled several bottles to be tested and told the farmhand it was time to go. Days later, Jeremy got his results. Ensenda's municipal water was loaded with Shigella, and it was the same strain as the one found at Roberta's, Marty's, and all the other restaurants. The contaminated water had been sprayed directly onto the parsley right before being shipped to restaurants all across North America, where people like Toby, Peyton, and their families ate the parsley without giving it a second thought. Jeremy knew they had been lucky in tracking down the source relatively quickly. He estimated that as many as 1,000 diners had caught. In the fall of 2003, two detectives were in the middle of a year-long homicide case involving the brutal murder of a 19-year-old girl. And for the first time, they finally felt like they had a viable suspect. However, when they pulled up to the suspect's house to conduct a second interview, the detectives quickly realized the house was abandoned and their suspect had just disappeared. And when they tried to track the suspect down, they discovered something totally bizarre that would turn their case on its head. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please bring the follow button to a fancier auction, and then when the bidding gets absurdly high, shock them with a taser so they wave their paddle by accident, thereby placing a bid, forcing them to buy a painting they can't afford. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 18, 2002, 19-year-old Ollie Kemp walked through the gate at the local pool where she worked in Leawood, Kansas, and headed towards a deck chair. Ollie had on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and she had a backpack slung over her shoulder. She also had a huge smile on her face because her boyfriend, Phil House, was sitting in the chair that she was approaching. Phil stood up. Ollie threw her arms around his neck and they kissed. Normally they wouldn't do this at the place where they both worked, but it was a gray, cloudy day and nobody was swimming, and there was no other employees on site. Ollie had only been back home in the wealthy Kansas City suburb where she grew up for a few weeks after finishing her freshman year at Kansas State University. And almost as soon as her summer break had started, she reconnected with her high school boyfriend, Phil. They had actually mutually agreed to break up before they went off to different colleges, but now that they were back together, Ollie felt like no time had passed at all. And it was nice that they even had the same summer job as pool attendants, so they got to see each other at work sometimes. Ollie asked if anybody had come to the small neighborhood pool that day, and Phil told her it had been empty except for the landscaping crew, and he thought maybe the pool maintenance worker was coming by later. Phil grabbed his bag and told Dolly he would pick her up that night for their dinner date they had planned. Then they kissed again and Phil walked out to the parking lot. After Phil was gone, Ollie tossed her backpack on the ground and sat down in the deck chair. She stared out across the empty pool and saw the landscaping crew trimming some trees on the other side of a low fence. They looked her way and smiled. Ollie smiled back, but she kind of shrunk down in her chair at the same time. Being alone at the pool near a group of men she didn't know made her feel sort of uncomfortable. But the landscaping crew quickly seemed to forget about her and get back to their work, and Ollie sort of forgot about them. Since there was literally nobody at the pool, Ollie decided she would do something for herself. She opened up her backpack and pulled out a few brochures for different educational opportunities she had for her upcoming sophomore year at college. Ollie got really good grades. She was a student athlete and was involved in multiple university clubs. In fact, she had been such an exemplary freshman at Kansas State that she had been invited by the US State Department to join a group of 60 students from across the country who would study abroad and learn about diplomacy and American foreign policy. Ollie knew it was a huge deal that she'd been asked to join this program, and she would have immediately jumped at the chance. But she also had another great offer. Her church group had asked her to join them on a study abroad trip to Russia, where she would work directly with young people in need, which was something she thought was extremely important. Both opportunities sounded incredible. Ollie still couldn't make up her mind on which one she wanted to take. But either way, she knew she wanted to travel and experience other cultures. Ollie had loved growing up in Louisville, and she enjoyed going to college not too far away. But she was ready to get out of Kansas for a while to see what the rest of the world had to offer. Around 3, after Ollie had gotten to the pool, there still wasn't anybody swimming, so she grabbed her backpack, stood up, and walked around the pool to a small table that was set up on the deck for employees. Once she was there, she pulled out her phone and called her boyfriend Phil, but he didn't answer her. So she left a message and said she was looking forward to their date that night. Ollie checked the time on her phone inside. Her younger brother, who also worked at this pool as an attendant, had told her he would come by a bit earlier to take over, so she could go home and get ready for her date. But that was still almost 2 hours away. She grabbed a book out of her backpack and started to read, but she didn't feel right doing that on the job. So she decided to do a little work to pass the time. Ollie got up, leaving her stuff on the table, and headed to the pump room, which housed pumps, filters, and other equipment to keep the pool clean. She was just about to start organizing the supply shelves when she heard a voice out by the pool. She thought maybe somebody had finally come to swim. Ollie called to the person and said she'd be out in just a second. About 2 hours later, at 5, Ollie's younger brother opened the gate to the pool, expecting to see his sister, but the pool was completely empty. He called out for Ollie, but she didn't respond. He walked to the restrooms, knocked on the doors, and called for her again, but there still wasn't any reply. This was really weird. His big sister would never just duck out of her shift early. He waited for a little while, thinking maybe Ollie had just run across the street for some food or something. But when another several minutes passed and Ollie still didn't show up, he started to feel a bit worried. Ollie's brother grabbed his phone and called his sister, but Ollie didn't answer, and so he dialed another number, his father's number, and when his dad heard what was going on, he said he'd be right over. At 5:25 p.m., Ollie's dad, Roger Kemp, arrived at the pool. He met Ollie's brother just inside the gate, and he told his son to stay right there. Roger shouted for Ollie over and over as he searched the area surrounding the pool, but Ollie never called back. And when Roger saw Ollie's phone, backpack, and book on the deck table, he was at a complete loss. It seemed like his daughter had just disappeared. He looked around for a little while longer, and as he did, he noticed the open door that led to the pump room. Roger walked through the door into that room, and right away, He saw there were pool supplies scattered everywhere, like they'd fallen off the metal shelves they were kept on. And he saw a large blue dart playing on the floor. And when Roger leaned down and lifted up the tarp to see what was underneath, his entire world shattered. His daughter Ollie lay face down on the ground. Hardy's shirt was tightly wrapped around her throat and she was naked from the waist down. Her hands and arms were scratched and bloody, her face looked badly bruised and beaten, and her hair was matted with so much blood it's tucked to the sides of her face. Roger grabbed his daughter and held her in his arms and told her to please stay with him. That evening, Sergeants Scott Hansen and Detective Joe Langer of the Lewiswood Police Department arrived at the neighborhood pool. They were still in shock from the call they'd gotten earlier from dispatch. A young woman had been brutally attacked at this pool, and she had been rushed to the hospital but pronounced dead soon after all. Violent crime in Lewiswood was rare, but a murder like this was just completely foreign to them. Hansen and Langer walked through the gate and they quickly met a couple of uniformed police officers who lead them around the pool to the crime scene. The door to the pump room was still open, and before they even walked in, the detectives saw pool supplies scattered everywhere and a pool of blood on the floor near a blue dart. The detectives put on their gloves and stepped into the room. Both men were known to be extremely calm and methodical, almost clinical when they conducted an investigation, but imagining what Ollie must have gone through in this room made it impossible for them to hide their anger. They were part of this community, and they couldn't believe that something this horrific had happened to a young woman from their town. After the detectives had looked around the pump room for a few minutes on their own, several members of the county forensics team arrived and quickly began pulling blood samples from the floor. But as the group started investigating the pool supplies on the floor, one of the forensic officers told everyone to stop moving. He pointed to a small white object on the ground, and he didn't want anyone to accidentally step on it or kick it. As the forensic officer inched across the ground towards this object, Langer and Hansen asked him, "What was it?" The forensic officer stared at it for a second and then said it was a small cap to a bottle, and specifically, it had a brownish-red stain on it. The other officers continued to scan the floor. Partially hidden amongst a bunch of pool supplies, one of them found a small tub antibiotic ointment, and it had the same kind of stain on it as the cap. The forensics officers put the cap and the bottle side by side and it was clear they went together, but both objects looked out of place among the other pool supplies on the floor. However, Detective Langer noticed an open first aid kit on a shelf, and he thought it might have come from there. But regardless, all the investigators felt sure that the brownish-red stains on the cap and on the tube were blood. So one of the forensic officers bagged the tube and the cap as evidence. While the forensic team continued their work in the pump room, the detectives walked back outside and made their way towards the pool. And they immediately saw that the arrival of the police had already drawn a lot of attention. Two uniformed officers were doing everything they could to keep a large and growing group of bystanders on the other side of the gate. The detectives headed over to the crowd and, with the help of the uniformed officers, they took down names and statements from everyone who was there who claimed to have been near the pool that day. One person in this group was the man who actually managed the pool, and he gave the detectives the names of employees and others who occasionally worked on site. Members of that landscaping crew were also in the group, and a couple of them said that the only strange thing they had noticed that afternoon was that somebody had been laying on their car horn in the parking lot, just honking over and over again. Also, one of the landscapers added that Ollie did not appear to be the first pool employee to arrive that day. Before her, a young man had been there, and when he and Dolly saw each other, they had kissed like they were girlfriend and boyfriend. Later that evening, Detectives Langer and Hansen sat together in a cramped interview room in the police station. They had met with Ollie's father, Roger, and also the rest of her immediate family. And after seeing how absolutely devastated they were firsthand, it had really motivated both detectives to do everything they could to solve this case quickly and bring some peace back to this family. A little while later, the door to the interview room opened and an officer lead in Ollie's boyfriend, Phil, who politely introduced himself to the detectives and then took a seat across from them. As the victim's boyfriend, Phil basically automatically had become the first suspect on the detectives' list, and the nature of this crime made it seem even more likely that an intimate partner could have committed it. The attacker had clearly been enraged and there was potential sexual assault. But only minutes into their interview, Phil had given the detectives his alibi. He had a job at another pool in the community, and he had gone there right after leaving the pool where he worked with Ollie. The detectives reached out to his employer at the other pool and they confirmed that Phil had arrived on time for a shift and had not left early or anything. We got it. And so Hansen and Langer asked Phil if he would still submit DNA samples, and he agreed to do it without any hesitation. And then after getting those samples, the detectives let him go. The detectives could not fully rule out Phil's involvement, but his alibi was very strong. So they had to admit to themselves that maybe this was not an open and shut case. Not long after the meeting with Phil, a young woman came into the police station requesting to speak to whoever was in charge of Ollie's case. Hansen and Langer met this young woman, and she told them she was one of Ollie's closest friends, and she had been at the pool that day, and she was sure she had seen Ollie's killer. The detectives quickly laid Ollie's friend to an office and sat down with her. And Hansen said he was surprised to hear that she was at the pool because everyone they'd spoken to so far had said nobody had been swimming that day. Ollie's friend said she had not gone swimming either. She said she had pulled into the parking lot of the pool and began honking her horn over and over again. She told them she was just doing it as a dumb joke, trying to annoy Ollie while she worked alone at the pool, but after honking, she never saw Ollie. Instead, she said she saw this guy walking out from somewhere on the far side of the pool. She thought it was Ollie's boss, so she stopped honking the horn because she didn't want to get Ollie in trouble. But this guy ended up walking to the parking lot and just driving off in an old pickup truck. Detectives Hansen and Langer couldn't believe this. Was there actually a chance this young woman just happened to be at the pool playing a joke on Ollie at the exact time of the murder, and that she had also seen Ollie's killer up close? It seemed too good to be true. Hansen asked her if she knew who the man was, but she said she didn't. However, she said the guy had kind of creeped her out because before he got into his pickup and drove off, he had looked right at her with a strange look on his face and smiled at her. As midnight approached on June 18, 2002, about 6 hours after Ollie's body had been discovered, her dad, Roger, walked into the University of Kansas City Medical Center and approached the morgue. He knew this was where his daughter's body had been taken for an autopsy the next day. Roger found an employee and told her he'd be staying there that night. The employee was confused and said they weren't really set up for visitors. Roger said he understood, but he couldn't bear the idea that his daughter was all alone. The employee nodded and said he could stay if he wanted to. Roger thanked her, took a seat on a bench, and began his overnight vigil. In the days following the murder, Detectives Hansen and Langer learned from the autopsy report that while Ollie did have bruises that seemed to indicate an attempted sexual assault, no sexual assault had actually taken place. They also learned that she had put up a major fight, and so the medical examiner and the forensics team hoped they would find samples of the killer's DNA under her fingernails. And so, while Hansen and Langer waited for these test results, they met with Ollie's friends and family to try to get a clearer picture of her life, and they quickly realized Ollie was not a young woman who lived dangerously at all. Ollie was a standout student. She did volunteer work, she had a job at school and also over the summer, and she didn't seem to do drugs or drink alcohol. For the most part, her close friends and her boyfriend, Phil, lead similar lives. So, the detectives did not think Ollie was mixed up in anything, or with anyone that would have made her a target for a violent crime. And when they got the result of Phil's DNA test, there was no match to the crime scene. In fact, none of the DNA samples collected so far matched anyone in the FBI's national database. And so, now Hansen and Langer had to face the fact that they might be dealing with one of the hardest types of homicide cases to solve, a murder committed by an unidentified stranger. These types of cases can be so difficult that police often use the old cliche about trying to find a needle in a haystack when talking about them, because the suspect pool is basically infinite. At this point, Langer and Hansen's strongest lead was the man that Ollie's friend had seen leaving the pool and getting into his pickup truck on the afternoon Ollie was killed. But the detectives had no idea who this guy was. So they had Ollie's friend sit down with a police sketch artist to describe the man as best as she could, and the police started distributing copies of the artist's drawing all over town. At first, This seemed like the right strategy to tackle a possible murder by a stranger, because people started contacting the Leawood Police Department with tips almost right away. But this quickly proved to be overwhelming because the man in the drawing kind of looked like a lot of people. He was white, in his late 20s or early 30s, a little overweight and starting to lose his hair. And so, Detectives Hansen and Langer soon found themselves fielding calls from all over the county. But most of these leads fizzled out almost immediately. At one point, weeks after the murder, the tips got so out of control in Leawood that people were approaching Hansen, Langer, and other members of the police force out in public just to claim that they were sure their brother-in-law, or their cousin, or some guy they saw was the person from the drawing. The investigative team got help from the county sheriff's department and other law enforcement agencies to try to pursue any viable lead. But none of these tips really seemed to go anywhere. And all of a sudden, months had gone by, and Langer and Hansen felt like, despite chasing countless leads, they had basically made no headway in the case. And when 2000 came to an end, 6 months after Ollie's murder, the detectives worried that the case was going cold and that they would soon be pulled off of it. On a morning in early February of 2003, so 8 months after Ollie's murder, Detectives Langer and Hansen were working together in Hansen's office when they got a message that Roger Kemp, Ollie's father, was there to see them. Langer and Hansen had made a point to meet with Roger throughout the investigation, but they knew he had grown frustrated that no new evidence seemed to be coming in. Hansen went out to meet Roger, handed him a cup of coffee, and then led him back to the office. The detectives began by apologizing to Roger that they didn't have anything new to tell him, but Roger said he knew they were both doing everything they could. Still, though, he refused to just sit around and do nothing. And he understood as well as the detectives that if things didn't change soon, Ollie's murder investigation would become a cold case. And so Roger said he had an idea that he wanted to run by the detectives, something he thought would help get the public thinking about Ollie's case again. He wanted to put the sketch of the man Ollie's friend had seen on some huge billboards in town, and maybe out on the highway. He said he also wanted to offer a $50,000 reward for anyone who provided a tip that led police to Ollie's killer's killer. Roger said he would pay half, and he believed he could get the city to provide the other half. Hansen and Langer discussed it for a second. At the time, using billboards in a murder investigation was a radical idea. Police generally use billboards to help in missing person cases, but Langer and Hansen had never heard of using billboards to showcase a potential murder suspect. Still, they knew they did need to jumpstart the investigation, and this would definitely get people thinking about Ollie again. And really, they were not about to tell Roger he couldn't do something that might help bring him and his family some kind of closure. A few days after this meeting, the first billboard featuring the drawing of the potential suspect went up in Leawood, and it would soon be followed by 3 more billboards. And almost right away, tips started coming into the police station again. And just like the last time this happened, it got overwhelming. But Langer and Hansen felt energized that the investigation had sort of gotten back on its feet. And so, the detectives and their team methodically followed up on any leads that came in. Then on June 18th, 2003, which happened to be the 1-year anniversary of Ollie's death, they got a tip that felt huge. Someone who had seen one of the billboards called the tip line to say the guy in the drawing looked exactly like someone he knew, a man named Ted Hoover. And when Langer and Hansen heard this name, it immediately rang a bell. And so they dug through Ollie's case file and they came back to the notes they had taken from the very first day of the murder investigation. And that's when they saw Ted's name. He was the owner of a local pool maintenance company. Detectives Langer and Hansen didn't waste any time. They got Ted's address, headed out to their car, and drove across town. And when they arrived at Ted's house, they saw an old pickup truck parked in the driveway. It didn't exactly fit Ollie's friend's description of the truck she had seen in the pool parking lot. But the detectives knew witnesses didn't always get all the details right, especially if they were uncomfortable or creeped out, like Ollie's friend had said she'd been. Langer and Hansen felt like, for the first time in this investigation, they might finally have the killer in their sights. Both men stayed completely calm as they approached the front door. They needed Ted to talk, so they didn't want to frighten him in any way. Hansen knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, a man answered. And this man looked remarkably similar to the sketch the detectives had been staring at every day for the past year. But the detectives didn't give off any signal that they thought that they thought. Instead, they introduced themselves and asked the man if his name was Ted Hoover. He said it was, and so the detectives asked him if they could come inside and ask him a few questions about the young woman who had been killed at the public pool a year earlier. Ted, who seemed as calm as the detectives, said sure, and he led them inside. The three men sat down in the front room of the house, and Detective Langer started things off by telling Ted that somebody had called the tip line and pointed to him. And so Langer wanted to know if Ted had been anywhere near the pool where Ollie worked on the day that she was killed. Ted remained totally calm. He said he was not surprised he'd come up on the tip line. He'd seen the billboards, and he knew he kind of looked like the man in the drawing. He also said he had not done any work on the pool where Ollie worked, but he did have a lot of clients around the area, so there was a chance he could have been maybe nearby that day, but he wasn't sure. And he wasn't great about keeping records of exactly what he did every single day. The detectives looked at each other. This all seemed way too convenient. So Langer asked if Ted had ever met Ollie Kim, either at the pool where she worked or somewhere else in town. And Ted shook his head. He said he didn't know her, and he definitely did not have anything to do with her death. The detective spoke to Ted for a bit longer, and he was very cooperative throughout the entire interview. However, he couldn't provide them with any kind of solid alibi. And so at some point, Langer asked Ted if he would submit a DNA sample just so they could cross him off the list. And at that point, the calm look on Ted's face completely disappeared, and he started acting very nervous. Ted must have noticed right away the vibe he was giving off, because he quickly told the detectives that his nervousness had nothing to do with the case. He just didn't like the idea of his DNA being part of some kind of national database. That just didn't sit right with him. The detectives tried to assure Ted that his sample would only be used to help with this particular case. But Ted said he didn't want anything to do with it, and he would need to speak with a lawyer. By the time Langer and Hansen left Ted's house, they were confident they had just found Ollie's killer. His appearance alone had already been pretty solid evidence. I mean, he looked exactly like the sketch, but also the detective just didn't buy his paranoia around the national database thing. They figured the real reason he was afraid to give a DNA sample was because he knew the results would incriminate him. Since Ted did not voluntarily give up a DNA sample, the detectives would have to find enough evidence pointing to him that would enable them to secure a warrant so they could demand Ted to provide a DNA sample. And they knew if Ted really was lawyering up, their case would need to be airtight just to get that warrant. So, over the next several weeks, the detectives tried to find any proof they could that Ted had been at the pool on the day Ollie got murdered. They got back in touch with the landscaping crew, Ollie's boyfriend, and anyone else they thought might have seen him, but they didn't have any luck. Langer and Hansen refused to give up on this lead, though it was the first time in over a year that they believed they were close to solving the case. So they dug deeper into Ted Hoover's background, hoping to find anything that might give them a clue. And they ended up finding something that completely blew their minds, because according to multiple government documents, Ted Hoover had been dead for over a decade. With this bizarre new discovery, Langer and Hansen went to meet with Ted again, but this time his house was empty, and none of his neighbors or clients had seen or heard from him. It was like he had vanished without the police even noticing. Hansen and Langer set out to find anyone who might know where Ted was, but nobody knew where he was. And nobody seemed to have spoken to him since he left. And the detectives knew that trying to locate a man who'd supposedly been dead for years and had seemingly just disappeared into thin air seemed like an impossible task. But the detectives caught a huge break when a couple of people who knew Ted said that before he disappeared, he had been dating a woman named Laura Barr. So Hansen and Langer shifted their focus to her. But tracking Laura down proved to be as difficult as tracking down Ted. She was nowhere to be found in Louiswood or anywhere in Kansas for that matter. Weeks, months, and then an entire year went by her, and the detectives were still trying to find this woman who could maybe lead them to the man they were actually looking for. And in the meantime, they had to tell Ollie's dad, Roger, that even though they believed they knew who had killed his daughter, they couldn't track him down. Finally, in the fall of 2004, which was almost 2.5 years after Ollie's murder, Detective Langer got a hit on Laura Barr. He alerted that Ted's one-time girlfriend, Laura, was now living in Connecticut with a man named Benjamin Appleby, an ex-convict who had been busted for armed robbery and indecent exposure. And when the detectives began digging into Benjamin Appleby's background as just part of their general investigation into Laura Barr, they realized Benjamin Appleby had a clear connection to Louiswood, Kansas, and to Ollie's murder case. In November of 2004, about 2 weeks after Langer and Hansen first located Laura, the detectives sat inside of an interview room with local detectives at a small police station in Connecticut. An officer led Laura in, and Langer asked her about her relationship with their suspect, Ted Hoover, and any connection Ted might have to Ollie. Laura appeared to be as helpful as she possibly could be, but it became pretty clear within a few minutes of talking to her that she didn't seem to have any helpful information or really any connection to the murder. However, when her new partner, Benjamin Appleby, stepped into the interview room later that day, everything changed. Just looking at Benjamin made the hair on the back of Langer's neck stand up. And as the detectives spoke to Benjamin, slowly but surely they realized he must know more about what happened to Ollie than he was letting on. And so, the detectives went on the attack, asking blunt and aggressive questions. And this tactic paid off because the more they pushed, the more Benjamin began to crack. And soon Benjamin broke down crying and said he knew who killed Dolly. Based on Benjamin's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected over the course of the investigation, this is what police believe happened to Ollie Kemp. On the afternoon of June 18, 2002, the killer walked through the gate and began to scan the area. They saw the pool was completely empty and that the landscaping crew that had been working nearby had moved far enough away that the killer could remain out of their sight. The killer walked around the pool towards the pump room and then said out loud, "Is anybody here?" Even though the killer had clearly watched Holly from the parking lot and seen her walk that way, so they knew she was over here. And a moment later, Ollie called out from the pump room that she'd be out in a second. And when the killer heard that, they felt a rush. And before Ollie could even step out of the pump room, the killer stood in front of the door and blocked it, and then made a lewd remark about Ollie's appearance and also made a clear sexual advance towards Hart's. But Ollie brushed the killer off and told them to get out of the way and tried to walk past them. The killer grabbed Ollie and touched her breast, at which point Ollie threw a punch. The killer blocked Ollie's fist and immediately lost it and flew into a rage. They grabbed Ollie by the shoulders and shoved her further back into the pump room, but Ollie fought back, swinging her fist and scratching at the killer's hands and face. But the killer slammed her into the metal shelves and pool equipment fell onto the floor. Ollie kept fighting, but the killer punched her in the head and face several times, stunning her and causing her to begin bleeding badly. The killer threw Ollie to the floor and tore off her shorts and underwear. But Ollie kept fighting back, so the killer punched her again and again until Ollie finally stopped moving. At this point, the killer got up, opened a first aid kit that was on one of the shelves, grabbed a bottle of antibiotic ointment to use as a lubricant, and got back on the floor. Ollie was still breathing, but she could no longer fight back. The killer began to undress themselves, then they took off the cap of the bottle and climbed back on top of Ollie. And just then, the sound of a car horn began to blare over and over again from the parking lot, and the killer panicked. By this point, they had already decided they were going to rape and then kill Ollie. But now they were worried they were running out of time. Somebody was here, they were gonna get caught. So the killer reached for the bottom of Ollie's t-shirt, and at that point, Ollie began moving again and she tried to fight off the killer one more time. But the killer turned Ollie over, pulled her t-shirt up to her neck, and wrapped it around her throat and strangled her to death. Afterwards, the killer stood up and stared down at Ollie's bodies. They looked around the room and saw a large blue tarp tucked in a corner. The killer grabbed the tarp, covered Ollie's body with it, tried to pull themselves together as much as possible, and then walked out. The killer then made their way to their pickup truck in the pool parking lot, and before they got in, they made eye contact and smiled at a young woman who was sitting in her car. They didn't realize she was Ollie's friend and was the one who had honked the horn. The killer then drove home convinced they had not been seen by anyone who could pin Ollie's murder on them. And for almost 3 years, The killer would believe they had been right until one day a couple of detectives from Kansas came to Connecticut to question them. It would turn out Benjamin Appleby, the man who was Laura's new partner living in Connecticut with her, murdered Ollie. However, that was not remotely the whole story, because it turned out Benjamin Appleby was also Ted Hoover, the pool maintenance worker and the investigator's prime suspect. Benjamin had done prison time for multiple charges in Missouri, where he was from, so he decided to leave his name and his past behind. He moved around to a few different places, and eventually he assumed the identity of a boyhood friend of his who had died at the age of 13, Ted Hoover. And with this dead person's name, he moved to Louiswood, Kansas, and started his pool maintenance business. That's how he had first seen Ollie and decided that he wanted her. But when Ollie rejected his blatantly sexual advance one afternoon at the pool, he decided to rape and kill her. But Ollie's friend honking her horn in the parking lot altered those plans and made him go right to the murder. After Benjamin killed Ollie, he went about his life like nothing had happened. And even when Ollie's dad got the billboards put up with Benjamin's image clearly on them, he didn't panic. But when detectives Langer and Hansen showed up at his house asking for DNA samples, he realized they were closing in on him. So he decided to flee to Connecticut with his girlfriend, Laura, and start using his birth name again. But eventually, when the detectives tracked Laura down and learned she was living with this ex-con, a guy named Benjamin Appleby, well, they decided to look into Benjamin Appleby, and sure enough, it turned out he was Ted Hoover. When they finally interviewed Ben Appleby, aka Ted Hoover, in Connecticut, it seemed to the detectives almost like he was an entirely different person. The relatively calm, cooperative man they had spoken to in Kansas had transformed into someone who seemed completely devoid of feeling or empathy, someone they believed was evil from the second he walked in the door. In that interview, Benjamin ultimately confessed to everything. However, the detectives didn't want to leave any room for a court case to fall apart, so they finally got a DNA sample. And when the test results came back, Benjamin's DNA matched the sample they had taken from the blood on the bottle and bottle cap at the crime scene. Benjamin Appleby, aka Ted Hoover, was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole in 50 years. Roger Kemp's idea for running billboards with the potential murderer's sketch on them was a first-of-its-kind strategy in law enforcement. But now, as a result of its effectiveness in Ollie's case, this strategy has been adopted by police departments all across the United States. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.